One of the most remarkable and unsettling features of World War I was the enormous enthusiasm with which people greeted the war in the summer of 1914. Today, when we think about wars, whether the run-up to the Afghanistan War or the Second Iraq War, enthusiasm is not the word that comes to mind. Large numbers of people protested those conflicts. Public skepticism was widespread. Much of that caution comes from the bitter lessons of World War I, which burned away the romantic illusions people once had about war. But in 1914, before anyone understood what modern industrial war would look like, the mood was entirely different. Across Europe, crowds cheered, flags waved, and young men rushed to enlist. Let's look at why. Most Europeans entered the war believing it would be short, lasting no more than a few months, and many expected to be home by Christmas. Fueled by nationalism and patriotic enthusiasm, people across Europe viewed the conflict as a glorious opportunity to defend their nation's honor and demonstrate military strength. Some even saw war as a cleansing force that would sweep away political divisions, social tensions, and diplomatic disputes that had accumulated over decades. Rather than anticipating years of trench warfare, mass casualties, and economic devastation, many Europeans believed the war would provide a dramatic but brief solution to the rivalries and tensions that had been building among the great powers since the late 19th century. These expectations would soon prove tragically mistaken as the conflict evolved into one of the deadliest wars in human history. Vienna was determined to crush Serbian nationalism, which it viewed as a major threat to the stability of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austrian leaders were particularly concerned about Bosnia, the most nationally restless region within the empire. Bosnia contained a large Slavic population, many of whom sympathized with Serbia and supported the idea of uniting all South Slavs into a single state. The Austro-Hungarian government feared that growing Serbian influence would encourage rebellion among its own Slavic subjects and weaken imperial authority. As a result, leaders in Vienna saw the suppression of Serbian nationalism as essential to preserving the empire, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo provided the opportunity they had been seeking to confront Serbia directly. German society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was strongly influenced by militarism and a deep pride in the military traditions of Prussia, the state that had led the unification of Germany in 1871. The decisive Prussian victories over Denmark, Austria, and especially France helped create a culture that celebrated military achievement, discipline, and national strength. Many young Germans grew up hearing stories of their fathers' and grandfathers' service in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871, a conflict that had resulted in Germany's unification and the defeat of France. As a result, many viewed military service as both an honor and a patriotic duty. When World War I began in 1914, large numbers of young Germans enthusiastically volunteered for service, hoping to win glory for themselves and their nation just as earlier generations had done. Few anticipated the grim realities of modern industrial warfare, and many entered the conflict expecting a short, victorious struggle rather than the prolonged and devastating war that followed. France was determined to avenge its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871, during which the newly unified German Empire seized the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. The loss of these territories became a powerful symbol of national humiliation and fueled a desire for revenge that persisted for decades. Many French citizens viewed the outbreak of World War I as an opportunity to reclaim the lost provinces, restore national honor, and reverse the outcome of 1871. This determination helped shape French war aims and contributed to the widespread patriotic support for the conflict in its early stages. In many cities across Europe, from Paris to Berlin to Vienna, the outbreak of war in August 1914 was greeted with scenes of excitement and celebration. Crowds filled the streets, cheering soldiers, waving flags, and expressing confidence that their nation would achieve a swift victory. Newspapers and political leaders often portrayed the conflict as the beginning of a new Europe, a struggle that would resolve long-standing rivalries and strengthen national unity. Most people underestimated the scale and destructive potential of the war. Their expectations were shaped by the European wars of the late 19th century, which had generally been brief, decisive, and limited in scope. As a result, many assumed that this conflict would follow a similar pattern, and that victorious troops would return home before Christmas. These optimistic predictions proved catastrophically wrong. Instead, World War I evolved into a prolonged and devastating struggle that claimed millions of lives, transformed societies, and became one of the deadliest conflicts in modern history. As often happens during times of crisis, the outbreak of war in 1914 produced a powerful wave of national unity across Europe. Political parties, social classes, and interest groups that had previously been deeply divided temporarily set aside their differences in support of the national war effort. Many citizens viewed the conflict as a test of patriotism and rallied behind their governments, believing they were defending their nation's honor and security. One of the most significant political consequences of this surge of nationalism was the collapse of international socialism. Before the war, socialist movements across Europe had pledged to oppose war and promote solidarity among workers, regardless of nationality. However, when war began, most socialist parties abandoned their international commitments and supported their own governments. German socialists backed Germany, French socialists supported France, and similar patterns emerged throughout Europe. National loyalty ultimately proved stronger than class solidarity, demonstrating how the pressures of war could override long-standing political ideals and reshape the political landscape. For decades, socialists, especially those influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, had argued that workers shared common interests regardless of nationality and should unite against the political and economic systems that divided them. They believed that wars between capitalist states primarily benefited ruling elites while forcing ordinary workers to fight and die for causes that were not their own. Marx himself predicted that workers would eventually recognize their shared class interests and refuse to participate in wars between rival imperialist governments. By 1914, this vision seemed plausible. Socialist parties attracted millions of supporters across Europe. Trade unions were growing in strength, international congresses brought labor leaders together, and many workers embraced a sense of shared class identity that crossed national borders. In theory, this international brotherhood of laborers posed a serious challenge to the power of nationalism. In practice, however, nationalism proved far stronger than socialism when war began. As Europe mobilized in August 1914, most socialist parties abandoned their earlier promises to oppose war and instead supported their own governments. German socialists voted for war credits in the Reichstag. French socialists joined the national war effort, and workers across Europe enlisted in large numbers to fight for their countries. Rather than uniting across national lines, workers rallied behind their respective flags. The outbreak of war revealed that, for most people, loyalty to nation outweighed loyalty to class. The collapse of international socialist solidarity was one of the most important political transformations of 1914 and demonstrated the extraordinary power of nationalism in the age of mass politics. It collapsed instantly. The outbreak of war in 1914 quickly exposed the weakness of international socialist ideals in the face of nationalism. The moment hostilities began, workers across Europe overwhelmingly rallied behind their own countries rather than their shared class interests. German workers supported Germany's war effort. French workers backed France. Russian workers stood behind Russia. Austrian workers supported Austria-Hungary, and British workers volunteered for military service in large numbers. Socialist parties that had long promised to oppose war and promote international worker solidarity largely abandoned those commitments and endorsed their national governments. The vision of workers united across borders against capitalist conflict collapsed almost overnight. In its place emerged a powerful sense of national loyalty, demonstrating that, for most Europeans, devotion to their nation was far stronger than loyalty to class or international political movements. Even in Britain, where military service was still voluntary in 1914 and no draft had yet been imposed, the outbreak of war sparked a surge of patriotic enthusiasm. Hundreds of thousands of men rushed to enlist, overwhelming recruiting offices across the country. The demand for military equipment quickly exceeded the capacity of British industry to produce essential items such as uniforms, rifles, boots, food, and other supplies. Across the nation, workers, business owners, and political leaders temporarily set aside many of their economic and social conflicts in support of the war effort and the call to serve king and country. The British experience reflected a broader trend throughout Europe. Nationalism proved far more powerful than class solidarity. Karl Marx had predicted that workers would unite across national borders and refuse to fight one another in wars between capitalist states. Instead, when war came, workers overwhelmingly identified with their nations rather than their class, demonstrating that patriotic loyalty could outweigh the ideals of international socialism. Another major reason for the widespread enthusiasm at the start of World War I was the belief that a long war was impossible in the modern industrial age. Many politicians, economists, and military leaders argued that modern economies were too complex and interconnected to sustain a prolonged conflict. They believed that a war lasting more than a few months would cripple trade, exhaust financial resources, disrupt industrial production, and potentially cause economic collapse. Because of these assumptions, many Europeans concluded that any war between the great powers would have to be short and decisive. This belief reinforced confidence in quick victory and helped convince governments and citizens alike that the conflict would end within a matter of months. In reality, these predictions proved profoundly mistaken. Rather than collapsing, industrial economies adapted to wartime demands, allowing nations to mobilize vast resources and sustain the conflict for more than 4 years. The industrial age did not make long wars impossible. Instead, it enabled warfare on an unprecedented scale, fueling a prolonged and devastating struggle that consumed entire societies. Even Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan was built on the assumption that the war would be brief. German strategists believed they could defeat France in just 42 days by launching a rapid offensive through Belgium and into northern France. Once France had been knocked out of the war, Germany would then shift its forces eastward to confront the more slowly mobilizing Russian army. The entire strategy depended on speed and the belief that modern warfare would produce a quick, decisive victory. 42 days. That was the timetable upon which Germany's war plans rested. History proved this assumption disastrously wrong. Rather than ending in a matter of weeks, the war became a prolonged and devastating struggle. Germany failed to achieve a decisive victory over France, and by late 1914, the Western Front had settled into a vast system of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. What followed were 4 years of trench warfare, massive casualties, economic hardship, food shortages, political instability, and revolutionary upheaval. Millions of soldiers and civilians would lose their lives before the conflict finally ended in 1918. Yet in August 1914, few people could imagine such an outcome. Across Europe, political leaders, military planners, and ordinary citizens alike remained convinced that the war would be over quickly and that victory would be achieved long before the end of the year.